Ja, also. Sehr gut. Very good, thank you. So, next talk here is?
I think Stefan, he's waiting impatiently.
Yeah.
There, over there in the corner.
He's an economist and he's a member of the Club of Rome. Give him a warm applause.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for having me at your conference here in Dresden. And I'm very proud and honored to present 8 arguments behind a story on how to finance our Anthropocene. You know, in 2015, the UN met in September in New York, and world leaders signed in for our common roadmap, the UN Sustainability Development Goals. And in the same year, the World Academy of Arts and Science met and came up with the question on how can we finance all that? Can we come up with an out-of-the-box approach? And ever since, we had several conferences and papers and background meetings all over the world. And I would like to present here in this conference kind of 8 arguments behind this story. How Wall Street and central banks are ending poverty, tackle climate change, and meet the UN SDGs in 2 decades. You know, when you come up with out-of-the-box solutions, you're confronted with several phases. The first phase is, it's crazy. The second phase is, it's crazy. The third phase is, it's still crazy. The fourth phase is, oh, it's interesting. The next phase is, it's actually obvious. And the last phase is then, why haven't we tried that before? So this is what we're in right now. I would like to present 8 arguments with you. The dawn of a new era, the missing link, the real tragedy of the commons, how to upgrade our monetary regime, beyond the obvious, a more historical perspective on our argument. I would like to present a case study and then end with multiple new territories on how to finance our common future. Let's get started. First, there is this saying that we are living now in a new era, an era where everything is interconnected with everything, and we have to operate within planetary boundaries. An era where, for example, a pandemic causes the world community into a mental preparedness for change, where suddenly 7.5 billion people are synchronized to change, kind of a planetary momentum. In an era where we're learning that asymmetric shocks like climate change, species loss, land degradation, pandemics, wars become the new normal. And where we're learning that we have to differentiate between uncertainties and risks. Uncertainties will always remain part of the system we have to deal with. Risks can be quantified. You kind of put a price tag and a probability on it, and then you can kind of manage it much better. It is this era Paul Cruson called, this Nobel Prize winner in chemistry about 20 years ago, called the era of the Anthropocene, where the UN came up with a roadmap. The UN SDGs, the UN Sustainability Development Goals, and further, more on a continental level and on a national level, different forms of green deals, how to finance that. And the initiative of the World Academy of Art and Science trying to kind of step in and say, there's something missing in this debate we're trying to tackle. And we call our initiative the Tao of Finance. And why that's the case, I'm going to show you later on. So we are kind of in times in between. You know, what you see here is that there are normal evolutionary phases in society, and there are different ones, right? And when you look at this asymmetric crisis ahead, we can say we're actually not in consecutive crisis. They're rather symptoms of a fundamental change in the societal aggregation we're in. It's like water. You know, water can be fluid, it can be liquid, it can be vaporous. Depend on the state water is in, water expresses itself in a different way. And this is where we are. We are in a societal state of aggregation which is changing. And this could be rather upwards or downwards. It could be progressive or regressive. Both ways. And this is affecting everything. You know, this is affecting education and economics and politics and agriculture and research. This is affecting our daily life, our mindset, but this is also affecting the financial system. And this is what I'm going to talk about. Second argument. What's the missing link? You know, money and finance is not a neutral veil. It's not like a thermometer you stick into the water and measure the temperature or you measure the price. The money system and the financial system from the very beginning enables or distorts the entire process with regard to sustainability. You know, it's only since last year that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, basically started modeling and considering the financial sector with regard to our entire sustainability pathway. Traditionally, finance drives sustainability, meaning if there is money, we fund and manage sustainability issues, and if there's no money, we don't. In fact, it should be the other way around. It's not that finance should drive sustainability. It should be sustainability should drive finance. We have to come up with the right monetary and financial design that enables to live in a better, greener, more sustainable future. And with regard to the UN SDGs, the figures are clear. We need about roughly 5+ trillion US dollar annually, additionally, over the next 2 decades. And this is fundamentally affecting the balance between the privates and the commons. Between, are we going to finance our future with private assets only, or do we consider public assets, and how do they interfere? Look at the last publications of this famous hedge fund manager, Ray Dalio. He published several very fundamental books, called them The Principles, in order to explain the rise of new world orders. And he had data and presented data over 500 years. Very robust, very evidence-based. And he shows there's ongoing cycles, starting from the Dutch to the Brits to the US, and now shifting over to the Chinese. And each time this new world order starts with peace and prosperity and productive debt growth, and then comes up with the debt bubble and big wealth gaps. And then you meet the momentum, and then there's debt busts and economic downturns, and you start printing money, and at the end you have a revolutionary war, and now a new world order emerges. And if you look closer to this Ray Dalio argument, he was even able to identify very discrete steps along this cycle. You know, in the first 8 steps, when the new order is in place, strong leadership, inventiveness, investment in education, strong culture, good resource allocation, good competitiveness, strong income growth, and a strong market are basically characterizing this upswing. And at the top, you start getting less productive and overextended, and the wealth gaps are increasing, and then there is the decline. What's so important about this Ray Dalio argument is, on one side, it describes a 500-year history. On the other side, it looks like it's a natural law. It's inevitable. It's like we are on an automatic pilot over hundreds and hundreds of years, and we cannot really change that. Or we can, as Mr. Dalio says, at the most postpone this cycle. And I think Dalio is missing an opportunity. In his entire book, he is not challenging the design of the monetary and financial system itself. And this is why we're basically just ending from one big cycle to the next. He has left out the money creation process untouched. In fact, if you look in textbooks, what you see in all economic textbooks in the world, you see this triangle between real economy, ecology, and social world. And this figure, this picture, is actually misleading. We have to look at it from a different perspective. We need a different frame in the brain. And the frame in the brain that's required is rather an attractor, where the money system is at its core, and the social world and the real economy and the ecology are just around it. And if we design that monetary system in the right way, we can enable sustainability. And if we don't, we won't. Money is not a natural law. Money is like club rules or a marriage contract. We can change. This is the second argument of the story. Let's get to the third argument. You see, we're digging deeper into it here. The third argument is about the real tragedy of the commons. You know, from an empirical perspective, about 85 to 90% of our global wealth is privatized, which leaves about 15% for the public sector. And the public sector and public goods are characterized by their excludability, by their misuse or overuse due to so-called free rider effect. We can define a common or a public good as a right, an access, or a service everybody can use equally. and which is regulated by the peers involved. And we traditionally fund these commons and these public goods by either taxation schema in one way or another, or by the change in property rights. So we define this is now a common or this is now a private good. Or thirdly, to new monetary policy. In fact, it's mainly a mix of all the three. But we end up that the private purse is not the public purse. I want you to keep that in mind. The private purse is not the public purse. And the economics and financing of the commons is fundamentally different to the economics and financing of the privates. This is where we're going to end up if you're not able to fund our common goods and our public goods in the right way. We end up with extreme social and ecological externalities and inequalities, and we end up with no common ground, with very rich and very poor people. And if you further develop that argument and differentiate between the private goods and the common goods, you see here in this table that private goods are basically claims with the limited private liability. They also cause free riders, but they're causing free riders with negative externalities which are paid for by someone else in the global south or in the future or by nature. You know, privates are characterized by an ongoing and basically unlimited yield maximation. They're often characterized by economists like positional goods, where you compare your private portfolio in terms of their value by someone else, like how many SUVs you have, or how many jewelries you have, or how many pools you have, right? Private goods are excludable, or club goods, as you say, but are restricted to a defined membership. So if you're not part of the club, you cannot enter this tennis club or this pool area. And at the end, private goods are unlimited in their growth rate. They're unsaturable and they're tradable. You can have unlimited SUVs. You can have unlimited pools and jewelries for your girlfriend. And it's nothing wrong with that. However, private goods are not public goods or common goods. Common goods are basically, they're basic needs for everybody. Common goods are characterized by a public property with the claim for collective liability. They also cause free rider, which are costs for the public sector. In most cases, common goods do not imply unlimited yield maximization, but rather are operating circular and regenerative. They just need to be maintained over and over again and upgraded. Commons are a collective entitlement for all of us, and they have a mean to an end. In most cases, they're not excludable and not rival, and at the core, common goods sooner or later reach a ceiling. Once a common is achieved, is funded, is implemented, the mission is accomplished. If we have enough collectively financed hospitals or nurseries or kindergartens or vaccinations, it's accomplished. That's the difference, I think, between the privates and the commons. And so we have two statements here to make. A common is not a thing. but an agreement or a rule of a given community that organizes a resource or an entitlement as a public matter instead of a private asset. And this is a choice. This is not a natural law. And the real tragedy of the commons is not their overuse, because the overuse is happening in the private sector too. That's not the, not the differentia specifica. It's not the free rider or the neglect. This is happening in the private sector too. But the misalignment of the underlying monetary system that prevents them from being funded, hedged, and managed properly. Let me just repeat this last sentence because it's so fundamental for our entire story and for our entire argument. The real tragedy of the commons is not their overuse, not free rider, and not neglect, but the misalignment of the underlying monetary system that prevents them from being funded, hedged, and managed properly. And then we end up with what we can call an iceberg effect. We have the public goods on one side, right at the baseline, and the privates. And we realize that the commons, though smaller in volume, are preconditions for the functionality of the private sector and not the other way around. And we're realizing that public common goods have their own limits. They're chronically underfunded. They're chronically, systemically over-indebted. They have to rely on taxation and fees. Under standard procedure, commons are funded pro-cyclically. They're causing crowding out effects. And in most cases, commons are considered to clean up the mess, to basically, how can you say, to manage the damage. And there's limitations to the private sector and private goods too. A private competitive market is operating on asymmetric information. It causes social and ecological externalities. It exploits or has a tendency to exploit the commons. And it has a tendency towards monopoly. So you have two conflicting opposites, the privates with their limits and the public goods with their limits. Can we actually overcome these limits or these polarities? Let's get concrete. You have a pork farm and preschooling. And the decision is, this is just an example. There are different forms of financing a pork farm versus financing preschooling. Pork farm is a representative for the private sector, and preschooling should be an example for a public good, right? So the traditional way, I'm just getting you through here, the traditional way is central banks create money for the commercial banking sector. The commercial banking sector provides a credit line for the pork farm. The pork farm itself causes a lot of negative spillovers, which have to be compensated with subsidies, ecological, social externalities, which finally the community has to take care of. And the pork farm itself is taxed, and we use this taxation and fees to fund the preschooling, which has positive spillovers for the community as a whole. In this scenario, which is the standard business scenario to fund preschooling and pork farms, commons and privates, we remain in economists call it a Pareto inferior equilibrium. We don't max out both the private and the public sector. We can do better. Look here. This is our proposal in the first place. Again, we're talking about what are the difference in financing a pork farm versus financing preschooling? We can do better. Central banks provide, besides this avenue, which remain the same in the first place, provides enough liquidity for multilateral developing banks, like developing financial institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, the European Investment Bank, and others. And they provide enough liquidity to get this preschooling done over and over again. You remember I told you commons have a ceiling. Once it's achieved, we basically have to manage that public good. And preschooling has a lot of positive spillovers for the community. And what's the difference is that in this part, the commercial banking sector provides the credit line for the pork farm. If you want to do pork, you do pork. That's private sector commitment. But you're not going to be taxed or very little taxed. But on the other side, you have to take care of the negative social and ecological spillovers you're creating with your pork on health, on the CO2. So we start differentiating between financing the privates and financing the public. We need a strong market system with strong market allocation on one side and a strong public sector on the other side to create a Pareto superior equilibrium with more welfare, with more well-being, and with more sustainability. And now we are here at the fourth argument behind the story. We have to unpack this argument. The technical term is strategic friendly triangulation. Let me make some preliminary remarks first. You know, when we're talking about sustainable finance, we're talking about the financial system itself becomes sustainable or robust. That's a good thing. But it's not the same thing than financing sustainability. Financing sustainability means we use the monetary and financial system to fund and hedge and manage our common future. And you know, the traditional way to do this is what we call an end-of-pipe finance, where the private and the public sector are two conflicting agencies or opposites that create a Pareto inferior equilibrium. Let's look closer to this argument. This is what we're in, right? We have central banks creating money for the classical value chain. And here, everything, the entire value chain globally has to run through pandemics, to species extinction, to carbon bubbles, to damage controls over and over again. And we create our goods and services we're used to create. And at the end of that pipeline, we tax and fee this value chain and create a certain amount of money in order to finance SDGs. And at the same time, this value chain is pulled in the wrong direction by the shadow economy. Right? So this is the starting point we're in. And if you look closer to this value chain, you basically realize that there are multiple so-called lock-in effects. A lock-in effect shows you that whenever you're within this value chain, you can't get out of it. You know, the system is inherently unstable. The shadow economy, as I mentioned, is pulling us in the wrong direction. Ongoing subsidies and taxation schemes, in one way or another, are sterilizing each other. We have a carbon bubble, species loss, pandemics, land degradation, wars, all happening in the same value chain. We have an ongoing, as system and complex theory shows, an entropic sector, which ongoing disaster management. This is extremely expensive and in part insufficient because the amount of money you create through this end-of-pipe, through this end-of-pipe finance here is too slow in speed and too low in volume to guarantee that we can really fund our future and fund and hedge and manage our coming goods. You know, in this context, what did central banks do? This is just a cloud of dozens of abbreviations. And regulators and central banks trying to manage this to different measures and interventions. And there is, a pandemic emergency preparedness plan, not refundable loans, the QE process. You don't have to keep this in mind. You see them in publications and you see them in the statements of regulators. They have some overlapping, this cloud, right? Despite the different legal frameworks and despite the different liabilities and durations and maturations, they have a common ground. And the common ground is that the regulators are creating in one way or another additional liquidity to finance all this disaster. So here we are. So if we agree, let me just get this together here. If we agree that private and public sector are somewhat opposites, and if we agree that they're causing lower welfare, less well-being, a Pareto inferior equilibrium, can we get out of this opposite constraints? And we call it strategic friendly triangulation. There is an indispensable triad where the regulators themselves, meaning the central banks basically, became the new players in the new game in town. And they are able to overcome the polarities. And this is how it looks like. Traditionally, we have market and state, as I say, in their polarities. And the central banks here in this context remain basically passive. They basically remain neutral, restorative, and indirect. And you come up with a very small denominator between the market and the state with silo approaches, with linear approaches, with lower welfare. But you can do better. You have a strong central bank that is active and proactive, that is preventive, that facilitates private free market allocation at its best and ensures at the same time the funding of public goods at the same time. And then you end up with the friendly triangulation between the two instead of a polarity. That's the fifth argument now. Okay. I call it beyond the obvious. What time is it? Oh, we still have some time, right? Beyond the obvious. We take this argument about the friendly triangulation and basically unpack the argument now, and now we have to look closer to it. Why do we have to paralyze the system? Why do you have to digitalize the system? And why do we have to go direct? Over the last 10 years at least, there have been many initiatives in this field. Stephanie Kelton in the US, the so-called modern monetary theory approach, positive money, on a group in Australia, in Europe, in Germany, all over the places. They're demonstrating, which is extremely valid, that in a situation right now where asymmetric shocks are predominant, monetary policy is oversteering fiscal policy. So instead of taxing and feeing the system, we have to come up with a very wise and intelligent way in the monetary field to fund all these risks, uncertainties, and shocks ahead. And I'm actually very happy that we have this debate now. We didn't have 10, 15 years ago. We now have it. And all these initiatives are extremely valid and make very substantial contributions. But they differ from the initiative of the World Academy of Arts and Science in at least two aspects. And I would like to clear these two aspects further. Let's look closer to this argument. You remember I showed you this graph already? This is central bank, value chain, shadow economy taxation system into the sustainability pathway. And if you zoom in to this value chain, you basically can identify several factors. And one of the factors is that you identify is the entire value chain is still depending on 78, 79% on fossil energy. This hasn't changed the last 30 years. And this value chain is growing by 3-4% every year. And anytime we create an income in this value chain, it creates a multiplier of 1.5 to 2.2, creating additional income and multiple rebound effects. So if we create, at the end of that pipeline, a windmill here and feed back the entire income into this system here, we basically just consolidate the given system. We are locked in the given system. We basically sterilize and neutralize all our endeavors towards a green marketplace, towards a greener and more fairer future. And we actually risk to do more harm than good. And the entire debate on the biophysical data from waste, ocean cleanup, CO2 load, land degradation, humus loss, species loss, name it. They all reach from one year after the other, one all-time high. And this is also because we're feedbacking into the same system over again, even with our best endeavors right there, right? It consolidates what we actually didn't want. So, can we do better? Can we change the mindset to do better? We can. Instead of injecting money into the given system, we create this additional liquidity, what MMT, modern monetary theory, is requesting, not through the given system, but condition it in a parallel system. We start to paralyze the system. And I'm going to show you in the next argument that this is not only an odd idea of some academics, this is happening already. We just have to enhance and enlarge this argument. Let's look closer to why we really have to paralyze the system, right? And why we have to digitize the system. And what are the impact of doing all that together and going direct into funding hedging our common goods, right? And that's actually not obvious in the first place. There's at least 4 phases how to paralyze. You know, we cleared why to paralyze, because we need the wedge to make it happen. And we can start introducing a digital smart contract in this digital currency system that prevents fraud, illicit transaction, and informal sector activities very quickly. In the second phase, we introduce additional financial instruments that allow us to hedge planetary and systemic risks, like harvest default swaps, through the same mechanism. We have the technicalities and the functionalities of swaps and CDS already available. We just transfer them and condition them within the green marketplace. Third, we accept digital direct cash transfers to affected populations, for purposes such as overcoming poverty or hunger. And this is in part also happening already, but we can enhance and maximize that argument. And in the fourth and later stage, we can start steering our entire economic activity towards a more sustainable marketplace by avoiding social and ecological externalities, like the way we use alcohol or tobacco or pesticides. This is the way we have to shift from the conventional to the green marketplace. And the same is true if we have to answer why we have to digitize the process. We have ample evidence that if it's done in the right way, we avoid bank runs and create and overcome disintermediation. We lower the transaction costs. We create a frame where the money is spent anti-cyclical, where the state becomes an investor or first resort of market makers, where we basically end money laundering, free rider and illicit transactions over and over again. We create a situation through digitization, what's called an inverse information asymmetry. Suddenly, those who have the data have even more information than the market players. More data, more information, more insight. It's data-driven economy. We create an end-to-end automation. We create the beginning of a new economy, which is called a token economy, with more transparency, with more trust, and more traceability. And on the level of the state and the level of the regulators, we regain control over what we're doing in order to manage spillovers and externalities. And fundamentally, it's basically a paradigm shift. It's a paradigm shift where digitization and parallelization are key towards a more integral consciousness. Some call it consciousness consumerism. So this is where we are. We start doing this in parallel to the classical value chain. And we can create, don't worry about that, I can send you these data. We can create over 30, over 40 positive externalities and impacts and second round effects coming out of this parallelization and out of this digitization. Positive distributive effects. We go beyond windfall revenues. We can better manage opportunity costs over and over again. I'm not going to go through this slide now, right? And this is where we are. It's like riding a bike with two wheels instead of a unicycle. We create multiple second round effects with this dual system, dual digital system. If it comes to funding common goods, it's a multi-stakeholder perspective that is really now able to overcome the lock-in effects I've described in the previous arguments. It is fast, and fast means we can implement that in less than 18 months. It's targeted towards the purpose we've decided in the first place, and it creates more welfare and more well-being for all of us. And this is why we call that initiative the Tao of finance, because it's the yin and the yang, the conventional and the complementary, the traditional and the green. And for the time being, we need both. We got to get out of this silo linear approach in funding our commons. We got to go back into a different mindset to make that happen. Right? This is why we call it the Tao of finance. We're already at the sixth argument, the sixth argument behind the story, sorry. If you don't buy in so far and say, this is too freaky, this is too odd, this is really not the way to go, you can also look back in history. And we've been in exchange with historians and economists, historical economists, who are trying to answer the question how monetary systems, how currency systems have been operating in the past. And there's one interesting finding that over the last 1,000 years, the vast majority, which means more than 50% of each single year of the last 1,000 years, societies have run their economies on dual currency systems. Isn't that fascinating? They're using basically local currency systems in order to make their local trading, and they're using at the same time in parallel another currency system, basically gold-based or gold standard-based, for international trading with people they don't know. Between 1930 and 1935, the fascists in Germany terribly misused this dual currency system and the so-called MEFO swaps. It's a proof of concept, terribly misused, leading to the Second World War. But at the core, the monetary regimes implies a dual system. Throughout the entire 20th century, you can find so-called complementary regional currency systems already. There are over 3,500 available globally, like Regio money or Let's system, local barter systems, etc. They are macroeconomically completely, believe me, completely irrelevant. Completely irrelevant. But they show on a sandbox approach that there is a need for a parallel system, there is a need for additional liquidity, there is a need for money with a purpose. And they also show, all the 3,500, that it's working. You can also look at the IMF initiative of the special drawing rights. You know, when the IMF was founded in 1944, the idea was that the world community needs additional extra liquidity to fund their international trading. Take that initiative, which goes in the right direction, with the right institution, and take it one step further, like all UN members funding their UN SDGs through the same mechanism and creating the additional liquidity through special drawing rights on a parallel digital currency system. Then we're right there. Look in the 21st century. We have private digital cryptocurrencies. They have a market capitalization of over 5 trillion already, completely unregulated, completely privatized and speculative. But they demonstrate there is a need for something else than what we're doing right now in the monetary regime. And since about 15 years, I would say, or 20 years, 89 central banks are operating in that field already, called CBDCs, central bank digital currencies. They, if done in the right way, they can operate anti-cyclical, anti-inflationary, where you can go right direct to fund and hedge our common future. You can do harm with it by messing it up, but also you can do right. The technicalities are right there. The MIT has published, I think 2 months ago, a paper where they demonstrate that they can run a CBDC, an anti-corruptive CBDC with the crypto block, 1.4 million transactions per second, which is about 5 times more than Visa is doing. So this is where we are from a more historical perspective, if it comes to explaining why we need to parallelize, digitize, and going direct. Okay, we're almost there. There's two more arguments behind the story. And I would like to use one concrete case study right now where our approach can be facilitated right away, which would make a huge difference. How to tackle with imported energy and food price inflation. We're currently experiencing all over the world. A 1% increase in food price globally is causing 10 million people more at the poverty level. And this whole started in 2001 under Bill Clinton, where they inaugurated an act that deregulated commodity markets and allowed betting and speculating on food prices. We can assume that asymmetric shocks will have an additional impact on the CPI. CPI stands for Consumer Price Index. So it's not a neutral thing. Climate, species loss, land degradation. It's going to be expensive in one way or another. We are experiencing this now, right? with the Ukraine war. It can destabilize whole economies and political systems. And it's basically affecting the lower income households much more, in the lower income countries much more than the higher, because their share on food and energy is 3 to 4 times higher per income than in rich OECD countries. And at the bottom line, an imported energy and food price inflation can counteract any sustainable pathway. So this is how it looks like. Look, you have imported food for an economy and imported energy. We know that there is links between the two, actually, you know. The imported food depends on the energy because we have to run a tractor, we have to buy a fertilizer, they're interconnected. And they enter the economy and they basically cause over and over positive feedback loops, so-called wage and price spirals, that end up finally with a harmonized consumer price index higher than before. And if you take that argument one step further and assume that over the next 25 years, 2.5 billion people are going to live in big cities, exposed to international speculative prices in food and energy, the relevance of imported energy and food price will even become more important. And how do all governments in the world tackle this? They cut taxes, provide subsidies, or they start diversifying the supply chain. They encourage people to reduce their aggregate demand and increase efficiency by research and development. Most, if not all, countries are introducing price controls and try to increase the interest rate above the inflation rate to counteract that disbalance. But the entire process is expensive, slow, requires a high regulatory effort, and it basically acts like a regressive tax. It's a downstream approach, right, at the end of that value chain. Let's take a case study of the EU. And the EU, we are basically importing about 350 billion euros per year. The EU GDP is 15 trillions, roughly. Let's assume an imported inflation of 100%, which means the 350 going to increase to another 350 on top of it. We assume a multiplier of 1.8 to 2.2. This is just half of the bill. We have to assume a lot of indirect costs due to unemployment, social upheaval, the instability of the political system. On top of it, which normally adds another multiplier of 4 to 6 times the initial increase of the price. So we end up with full costs of roughly 3 trillion extra euros per year. Right? So just to clear the data, this is the amount of money causing the imported price inflation, and this is where we end up in Europe. Very likely this year. Do you see it again? 350 running through the entire economy, increasing the harmonized consumer price index. We actually can do better. If we take the entire lecture and take a spin-off of the argument we're trying to discuss here, we can implement the so-called monetary inflation brake. Instead of looking for interventions downstream, we're looking for an intervention upstream, which can be done much faster, cheaper, and more preventive. We basically create a monetary inflation brake right here. How does it work? The European Central Bank creates 350 billion euro extra through a QE process, through a quantitative easing process, and takes that money upfront, upstream, cross-border, and sends that money through, for example, the European Investment Bank to the 12 or 15 importers of gas and oil as a rollover position to pay that extra delta. And with these 350, we basically sterilize the 3 trillion euro bill, which includes all the indirect costs of social upheavals, bankruptcies, the negative impact of increased income gap and unemployment. You know what's happening with the 350? Upfront, rollover, upstream. The energy exporter, who now has a euro with the lower face value compared to the dollar, is facing to go shopping in Europe. And this is going to stimulate our own export industry. And if you ask lawyers, they can demonstrate this can happen within the given primary EU treaties. It's basically only 3 paragraphs, 127, 128, and 136, chapter 2. We don't have to change the treaties in order to implement new monetary regime to tackle imported energy and food price. This is how it looks like, you know? This is the money, the base money central banks are creating. They're doing this anyway. And this is sent to pay the bill. And now we suddenly have additional green digital euros, which basically are stimulating our export industry by protecting our economy for about 1 or 2 years. You cannot do this monetary inflation break over and over again, of course. You cannot do it forever. But you can do it as an umbrella, as a rescue umbrella, to have our economy shift from fossil to green, to become energy autonomous at the same time. Much better than cleaning up the mess at the end as we've been used to do it. Final argument. Final story. Let me just go there. If you're able to consider 3 constraints for an economy: the amount of human resources, like employment, unemployment; the amount of natural resources, like land, rare materials; and the amount of external debts, which basically means being indebted in a currency you cannot control. If you consider these constraints, we can create money and multiple financial engineerings and assets to fund, to hedge, and to manage our common future. We were able to show in different other scenarios new collateral debt obligations, swaps, new so-called PPPs, like private-public partnership blended financial instruments, new forms of so-called advanced commitment strategies, de-risking instruments, state guarantees, direct cash transfers, swaps, carry traders, multiple, almost unlimited territory is possible if we change our mindset in the way we're going to finance our commons and our common future. And this is then where we start from financing drives sustainability towards sustainability drives finance. And you know, at the end of the day, especially currently when we're seeing the war in the Ukraine, where different political systems are clashing with different political agendas, our approach has the beauty not to address the political agenda in the first place, we leave the political agenda and the controversial agenda aside and say we have a common goal. And this common goal is basically our common future. And this common future has to do a lot with our common public goods. I'm going to skip these policy recommendations you can basically download through this file. And I want to end with this graph. You know, the World Academy of Arts and Science published last year this book, Financing Our Future, where I just outlined now some of the arguments behind this story. But at the same time, another book got published by Stan Lee Robinson. He is a fiction novelist. He wrote a book called The Ministry for the Future. And you know what's exciting about this book? It describes in parallel, without knowing our activities of our working group, as a science fiction story and narrative, basically our argument to paralyze, to digitize, and to go direct in order to fund our common future. So we have a situation where fiction meets facts, and science fiction means scientific findings. I found that extremely thrilling. Well, thank you very much for having me here in Dresden. Thank you very much for having me at your show, and I'm looking forward for an interesting Q&A. Bye.